Greetings. Hopefully we will finish verse 2 in this video. That verse ends by the statement, to the churches of Galatia. So I thought what we would do now is recapitulate the missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas and a few others took to Galatia, that very first missionary journey. The account is in Acts chapters 13 and 14, if you want to read that and check my facts. Often I am thinking one thing and I say another, and so if you catch me in a misstep, then please let me know. But I will try to focus my attention on what I'm saying and make it accurate. Paul and his company left Antioch by boat. They sailed first to Cyprus. It isn't clear why they went to Cyprus, but that was Barnabas's homeland, and so perhaps he had some kind of family reasons for going there first. And from Cyprus, then they sailed up to the seaport, Perga, which is roughly in the middle of the southern coast of what is now Turkey. Perga doesn't exist anymore. Its ruins were about 10 miles to the east of the city, the modern city, Antalya. You can look that up on a map. From Perga, then, they went inland. They went about 100 miles inland to another Antioch. There was the Antioch that Paul came from down in, it was the province of Syria at the time, and this Antioch is also just ruins. So it's in the middle of Turkey, but it was a major city of the time, and Paul began to preach there. This was the first missionary journey that Paul had undertaken, and so this was the first evangelistic sermon that he gave on a missionary trip. And so Luke preserves a fairly lengthy account of what Paul said there in Acts chapter 13. It made quite an impression on the synagogue, which is where he was giving it, and a lot of the people wanted to hear him again. So they asked for him to come back the following Sabbath. So the next Saturday, apparently word had gone around the city, and Luke tells us that nearly the whole city came to hear Paul. And he had a powerful effect on them. A lot of the God-fearers in the congregation, as well as many of the Jews, believed what he said. But the leaders of the synagogue didn't believe it. And this is the first time that the New Testament refers to the Jewish leaders as being jealous of the Christians. And partly that was because, after all, they had been in Antioch for a long time evangelizing, and they had made some inroads into the Gentile population, got a few partial converts anyway, but now Paul seemed to be taking everybody away. In Luke's account, he says that the leaders of the synagogue kind of entered into an alliance with some of the prominent women of the city. It doesn't explain why it was women who were involved, some of the wealthier wives there. But that's what it says. And together they began persecuting Paul and Barnabas. So when the leaders had rejected Paul, Paul had basically separated from the synagogue and said, okay, we will set up on our own. This was to become Paul's routine in later visits to cities, evangelizing. He would always go to the synagogue first, and if he was rejected at the synagogue, then he would set up an alternative to the synagogue. In any case, there was some kind of persecution. It doesn't really say what kind of persecution. It doesn't say anything really that happened, but Paul and Barnabas left. They headed down the main highway and traveled about 80 miles southeast from Antioch until they came to the city of Iconium, which actually still exists. It's currently called Konya in Turkey. Now, originally, Iconium was a Phrygian city. If you remember in the account of Pentecost, there are Jewish people from Phrygia that are visiting Jerusalem at that Pentecost, the first one, when the Holy Spirit was poured out. And they hear the disciples speaking in Phrygian. That's one of the languages mentioned. So there was a sizable Jewish population there. It was founded by the Phrygians, but it had become a Greek colony at some point. Now, the Jews who had rejected Paul's teaching in Antioch, the leaders of the congregation, sent Jewish, I guess you'd call them militants, to follow Paul to hinder his preaching in the other cities. It says in Luke's account that they poisoned the minds of the people in Iconium. And this is the first time also in Iconium where it mentions that there were signs and wonders that were performed at the hands of Paul and Barnabas. It doesn't say what happened. It doesn't say what kind of signs, what kind of wonders. It just mentions that they happened. But nonetheless, they were rejected. At one point, it doesn't say either how long they had been there, but they had had some effect. There were people, a sizable number of converts there as well. And Paul and Barnabas heard a rumor that there was a plot on the part of their enemies to kill them. And so they left the city. What they did was they went south off the main highway to a town called Lystra, which also doesn't currently exist. There's ruins. They went about indeterminate number of miles to the south and arrived at Lystra. Now, Lystra was an unusual city. It was an important city at the time, but not on the main highway. It was actually a Roman colony. It was land that was taken by the Romans and settled by veterans of the Roman army. Rome used to pay their retiring soldiers with land, and so this was part of that settlement with the soldiers. So there were a lot of Roman soldiers and their descendants that lived in Lystra. Now, it was a particularly pagan city. And one of the first things that happened when Paul and Barnabas arrived there is that they meet a man who was born crippled, and they perform a healing. They pray over him, and he's healed of this, whatever it was that had been crippling him from birth. The people of Lystra immediately conclude that Paul and Barnabas are incarnations, appearances of the god Zeus and the god Hermes, that they are gods walking around, walking into their city, and so they are prepared to worship. Now, Paul and Barnabas don't understand the language. It takes them a while to figure out what's going on, and Luke says they could barely restrain them from worshiping them. But they did restrain them, and by that time, the stalkers from Antioch had caught up with Paul and Barnabas and incited the people to riot. This is the whimsical nature of pagan religion, that they can be ready to worship Paul and Barnabas one day and ready to kill them the next day. So they stoned them. They stoned Paul, anyway, and left him for dead. But he wasn't dead. Either he really wasn't dead, or he was raised from the dead. But in any case, he walked away from the stoning after everybody had left and went into the city and spent the night. And they apparently had some effect at converting people in the city. It must have been pretty impressive when he walked away. And apparently Paul's stalkers gave up at that point, thinking Paul was dead, so they went back home to Antioch. Meanwhile, Paul, Barnabas, and company, when they were ready, left Lystra, went back to the main road, and kept going to the east, arriving at Derbe. The stalkers apparently had not followed them there. There was no real persecution in the city of Derbe, which, by the way, doesn't currently exist either. It's ruins. And even though it was a peaceful stay in Derbe, Paul warns them that there's going to be persecution. Based on his experience in the previous 3 cities, that was a good warning to give them. At Derbe, though, he's reaching as far as he can conveniently go. He's reaching that, the very rugged terrain, the mountain range, headed back toward Antioch. And so instead of trying to proceed over that, he turns back and revisits all the places, all the churches he had already established. He doesn't seem to have preached publicly. At least none of his opponents seem to have noticed that he had come back into their city. He was mainly just meeting with the Christians, those people who were already converted, and strengthening them. It says he appointed elders, leaders of the congregations there. And he just visited them one by one, and back to Perga, and then back to Antioch. And that's really the story of these churches. So when Paul is writing this letter to the Galatians, he's writing to all 4 of those churches. And they had very different experiences, very different histories with Paul. Derbe, of course, was peaceful. In Lystra, there had been a very impressive miracle, healing. He had managed to alienate a considerable number of the pagan religious leaders, as well as perhaps some of the Jewish leaders. And each one of the churches had its own character. Some had experienced miraculous events more prominently than the others had, and some had experienced greater or lesser degrees of persecution. Luke mentions that in some of the cities, the Christians had to spread into the local countryside. And so those are the people Paul is writing to. It's not clear if he made 4 letters or if he wrote 1 letter and had it taken from church to church. And that's where we stand. In the next video then, we will go into verse 3. I hope to see you then. Good night.